So as I alluded to earlier, the sermon this week is actually a continuation of what was started 2 weeks ago when I read Jesus's recounting of what's called the Shema, which is one of the foundational prayers for the Hebrew people that you find in Deuteronomy 6. And we noticed when we read that when Jesus recounted Deuteronomy 6, that prayer that was near and dear to the hearts of all Jewish people, that he added something. And that he added to love God with all your minds. So we're going to just reread the gospel reading from Mark 12, verses 28 and 34. One of the scribes came near and heard the Pharisees disputing with Jesus. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, Jesus, which commandment is first of all? And Jesus answered, the first is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Then the scribe said to him, you're right, teacher. You've truly said that God is one, and besides God, there is no other. And to love God with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, Jesus said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared ask him any questions. All right, so first, a couple of mind jokes. What do you call a bee that can't make up its mind? A maybe. See, Diane, see how unsatisfying it is when you can't hear anything? Diane, you have to laugh extra loud here. All right. Now, I've only got one, and this one's not a laugher. You have to think about this one. Someone once told me it's okay to change your mind in light of new facts. I used to think that. I know some of you are still working on it. I'll give you a minute. There are two main points I'll have time for today. The first is, if we're focusing specifically on that text, what does it mean to love God with all of your mind? Then we have to ask ourselves, what is the mind from a biblical perspective? The second thing is, then once we come to terms with that a bit, what does it mean to love God with our minds? So first things first, what is the mind? When the word mind comes to mind, we usually think of the intellect, or as the part of us that thinks thoughts. And it is that, of course. But from a biblical perspective, it's a lot more than that. In fact, so much more that, as usual, we're pretty much going to be scratching the surface. But from the perspective of Scripture, the mind is the part of our human being that controls how we process life. What we go through, what we face, what we've been through, what happens to us. It's the part of us that creates and, thank God, has the power to edit or to change the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And when I say story, I don't mean, drama in a negative, dismissive, self-absorbed way. I mean how we understand the story of our lives. The narratives we tell ourselves about what has happened to us. Why? What that means? It's the part of us that tries to make sense of things, figure things out, figure out perhaps where we do or don't fit in or belong, how and why we're going to respond to certain things in certain ways, whether or not we're going to embrace an idea or a person, It's the center of our decision-making power. It has a whole lot to do with how we use the power of our will or react when willpower itself isn't enough to overcome something. The mind's also our center of our capacity to analyze things and break things down and take things apart and test things out and put things together and synthesize and comprehend and reflect and discern and strategize and compartmentalize. And these are obviously huge and vitally important and extremely powerful aspects of human freedom and capacity. So you're getting the sense, I trust, that the mind is a big deal. If our beings were ships, our minds would be kind of a combination of access to the engine room and all its power, and all that the captain at the wheel and at the instrument board has access to. The mind is also the part of our beings in which most of us get most conflicted and tangled up. The 12-step world has a great two-word phrase. They call it stinking thinking. Most of us have patterns of thinking and acting that's connected to those patterns that have not been healthy or life-giving for us, for people around us. In fact, often quite the opposite. The mind is also the part of us where most of us generate our stress and our anxiety. It's the part of us where most of us tend to get in our own way, where most of us create barriers between ourselves and others, and between others and ourselves and God sometimes. And here's maybe one of the most important things. It's the part of us that is most private and in which we can hide most completely. Think about it. Right now, I have no idea what any of you are thinking. It's probably a good thing, huh? But the point I'm making here is that this is one of the mind's greatest capacities. For the most part, it can do what it wants. And it can keep others from knowing what's going on in there. It's our power to be having a whole lot going on internally and somehow decide that we're not going to let anyone externally know what's happening in there. Some of us are very skilled at having what we playfully sometimes refer to as a poker face. Some aren't at all. It's a good blessing, I think, if you can't hide it, but who knows? I used to work with a guy, and he was just a master at being unflappable on the outside. And I used to watch him, kind of navigate his way around. And I finally just said to him one day, I said, no one ever knows what's going on in that head of yours, do they? And he smiled at me and said, nope. He said, if people knew what I was going on, what I was thinking, I would get myself into so much trouble. He said, usually most days I get here about 9, by 11, Elvis has left the building, trust me. I'm here in my body, but you're not going to know what's going on in me. In other words, it's one of our most private domains. And let's just pause right there and just feel the sense of respect that we all should have for the capacity of all of us to decide who gets access to what's in there or not, and why. In and of itself, that capacity to have autonomy over our thoughts is morally, spiritually, and ethically neutral. There are times when it's good and appropriate and necessary and wise and strategic and even loving for someone not to know what you're really thinking. As you know, I've done a lot of work in the country of Haiti. Haitians, one of the unique things about their culture is their capacity to be cunning. And that's not any kind of put down. It's what Haitian friends of mine have referred to it as 32ing, referring to the number of teeth and their capacity to smile at a good, well-intentioned, liberal white person. Smile, I'll dance for you if you want, I'll sing for you, as long as you keep the money or the help coming, but you're never going to have access to what's really going on inside me. That's how they overthrew the French, by the way, in 1804. Their capacity to smile at the master during the day while they were secretly organizing to overthrow them. No one would ever have known what was coming. As a Haitian friend of mine once put it, they call me Mr. B down there. He said, Mr. B, when we finally knew each other well enough to talk about this a little bit, I said, you know, I feel like I never really know what you're thinking. And he said, yeah, you don't. And you won't unless I decide to let you know. No one can take that power from another person. But this capacity to hide what's really going on is also right at the heart of where we so often go in directions that cause ourselves and others a world of pain. Why? Two reasons. Because this is where we become deceptive and duplicitous. In other words, to put it nicely, we're not truthful. Again, that's not always a dark thing. Honey, does my rear end look big in this dress? Now, I haven't done all that well in the area of relationships, but I've learned a couple of things. I'm going to give you the strategic answer to such a question. It is, sweetheart, you could never look anything but beautiful to me. You can use that. And isn't that what we all really want to hear anyway? But here's the thing. Our egos love it when we start playing games with the truth. And this is a mind thing. I'll come back to that shortly. One more quick thing, or two more quick things, before we get to our main question, which is, what does it mean to love God with our minds? Just about every major religion or spiritual framework makes two key points when it comes to the mind. First, we humans, are not our thoughts. We have thoughts. Some of us can't stop our brains from thinking, the never-ending hamster wheel. Some of us have had times when we feel completely out of control and at the mercy of our thoughts. I know how painful and overwhelming and crazy making that can be. But you are not your thoughts. So then who are you? Okay, right now, just pause then and become aware of what you're thinking. Right now, pause and say, okay, what am I thinking? You are the one who just became aware of your thoughts. For a split second, you stepped behind the thoughts and you saw your thoughts, or you noticed your thoughts. That's you. The one who can step behind the thoughts and see them. And in a nutshell, that's the whole purpose of spiritual disciplines like meditation. Learning how to spend more time, usually in silence and stillness, in the part of who is behind the thoughts. All right, the other thing is that the mind, which is not you, is simply and wonderfully a tool to be used, and you get to choose how you will use it. Incredible power God has given every one of us. The autonomy to decide who knows our thoughts and how we will use our capacity to do what the mind does. And I've heard this saying in various forms from many different traditions. The mind is a wonderful servant, but a lousy master. It's a wonderful servant, but a horrible God. Okay, so what does it mean to love God with our minds? It means to use this amazing tool, the mind, in ways that express love for God. And Jesus said, you can't separate what that means from loving your neighbor. It means using our minds for the purpose for which they were created. Why were our minds created like every other aspect of our beings? To know and experience the love of God, and then to embody and share and give that away to everyone and everything. So is your mind committed to that? To experiencing the love and presence of God, and to helping others know they are loved, and to pursuing truth and justice and all those things we talk about all the time that are at the heart of who we are as biblical people? Is your mind in the service of those things? Now, I got this far in my sermon today, and I realized I need another week. Because I know that for a lot of us, our minds, our intellects, have not made it easy, often for good reasons, to believe in God at all. And, we can't go too very deep in loving God if we're not so sure we believe there is a God. And so next week's sermon is going to be, who is God? How do we know? And what does it really mean to believe in God? And that's probably going to be a 10-week series, but we're going to start with that next week. Who is this God we're talking about? But the last basic point I want to make today if our minds and all of their capacity are not being used to serve God, to love God, to unify, to heal, to bring people together rather than separate and divide, if they're not being used for that purpose, they will almost inevitably be used to serve our own egos. Stick with me for the end here. The ego is who we think we are without God. The personality that shows up and makes its way in this world apart from any connection to God. Wayne Dyer used to say ego is an acronym for edging God out. The ego loves to call the shots. Now, I know some beautifully ethical and principled atheists whom I love very much. And all I say to them is that your ego is not necessarily running your life because you're committed to ethics of love. And when you talk about that love that motivates you, you and I'm talking about the same thing when I'm talking about God. We kind of use different language and come at it, and maybe you struggle with the notion of a personal being, etc. That'll be part of next week's sermon. But the majority of people I know, if their minds are not at the service of something bigger than themselves and more beautiful than themselves, then they will be at the ruthless service of their own ego's agenda. And in worst cases, have no idea that that's the truth. If the ego can control our minds, then it will wreak havoc in our lives. That's what it does. Unbridled, unleashed. And in many ways, the whole path of Jesus and any spiritual path is about making sure that our minds and our personalities are at God's service and not simply driven by our own private, selfish agendas. And all I'm going to say in closing is this. It requires constant vigilance for all of us, because our egos love to play mind games. It's the ego's primary tactic, and it can be so subtle. And I think this may be why Jesus added it as a separate thing. If you're a smart person, for example, you have a high IQ, you've identified yourself through your life as being someone who's pretty sharp intellectually, your ego will be incredibly tempted to always pick things apart, always find the problem, always push back, question things, take the other side, get into a debate. That in and of itself, the capacity to do that is not a bad thing. But ask yourself, when it comes to God or the Bible or things like that, are you using your mind's capacity to draw closer to God, to deepen your understanding? Or, and this is what the ego will do if we're not vigilant, to find a convenient way to keep a deeper, more challenging truth at a safe distance. Now, I only know this kind of stuff because I've done it plenty. I had my first real faith crisis in college. And I'm coming in for landing, don't worry. I was a religion major at Duke University and picking the Bible and church history apart intellectually. And it got to the point where I felt like, man, you can't really know any of this stuff for sure. I had so many good questions. How can you trust the Bible anyway? The old telephone technique. How do we, So here's what I did. And I wasn't honest enough to admit it at the time, even though deep down I knew I was doing it. I created enough wiggle room so that I could justify taking a vacation from the commitment of following Jesus. So that I, as a young man who really wanted to just kind of have some fun and party, could do my own thing and not have to worry about the ethical or moral implications of the Bible. That's what I did. And all I'm saying is that that's what all of us will do if we're not vigilant. I mean, look at climate change. For years, smart people have been lying to themselves and others, and other people using that to create enough wiggle room to say, well, we don't really know for sure, so we don't really have to make the changes that we must make if we're going to save the planet and ourselves. That's the antithesis of loving God with our minds. Instead, using it to justify a falsehood. And we all do it in, whether it's interpersonal stuff, you may be attracted to someone that you know darn well you have no business being attracted to. Be careful of what your mind does with that. Apart from loving God, it will create the wiggle room that enables you to go in a direction that will bring a world of hurt into your life. You understand what I'm saying? I think you do. So loving God with all of our minds means no games. God knows everything already anyway. And here's the thing. None of us do this perfectly. And that's why grace is so important and so beautiful. All God says is, hey, when you catch yourself pulling the W.C. Fields move, I think I've shared that with you before. Mae West one time in a movie walked in and saw W.C. Fields with a Bible and said, what are you doing reading that Bible? And he said, I'm looking for loopholes. Catch yourself when you're looking for loopholes. And loving God means, okay, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm going to start by just being honest and ask you, God, to help me. Be real. We'll leave it there for today. To be continued.